The burning hunger, the heat, in the Badlands did not just sit on the skin. It burrowed into the flesh, seeking to dry out the blood beneath. It was the Cretaceous period in what would one day be South America, but right now, it was simply hell. Ignis stood motionless in the shadow of a jagged rock formation. He was a Carnotaurus Sastrei, a creature built for a singular, terrifying purpose. Speed. Unlike the massive, lumbering Giganotosaurus that ruled the deep valleys, Ignis was a nightmare of aerodynamics and muscle. His skin was armored with rows of bony osteoderms that ran down his spine like rivets on a tank. His skull was short, boxed, and brutal, topped with two distinct, thick horns that gave him his moniker, the meat-eating bull. He was starving. The drought had lasted for 3 moon cycles. The fern prairies had turned to gray ash, and the massive herds of sauropods had migrated north, leaving only the desperate and the dying behind. Ignis shifted his weight. His legs were his greatest weapon, long, muscular, and capable of explosive bursts of speed reaching 50 kilometers per hour. But speed required energy, and energy required meat. His nostrils flared. The olfactory bulbs in his brain were massive, processing the chemical signals of the wind with surgical precision. He smelled sulfur. He smelled dry earth, and then a faint, metallic thread woven into the breeze. Fresh blood. Ignis stepped out of the shadow. It was 25 feet of crimson and brown scales, blending perfectly with the red rocks of the canyon. His tiny, vestigial arms twitched against his flanks, useless for grasping, but his power didn't come from his arms. It came from his legs and his jaw. He moved with a silence that belied his Teuton weight, placing his 3-toed feet carefully among the gravel. The scent was coming from the dry creek bed, a mile down the slope. As he crested the ridge, he saw it. A lone Gasparinisaura, a small, swift herbivore, was limping near a dried-up mud. It had been grazed by a raptor, likely days ago. The wound on its flank was festering. It was a small meal, barely a snack for a predator of Ignis's size, but starvation had stripped away his pride. Ignis lowered his head. His binocular vision, unique among many large theropods, locked onto the small creature. He calculated the distance. 200 meters. Too far for a sprint. He needed to get closer. He stalked forward, using the shimmering heat haze as cover. He was a phantom in the wasteland. When he was within 80 meters, the little herbivore froze. It lifted its head, sensing the displacement in the air. Now, Ignis exploded forward. The acceleration was violent. His tail, thick and rigid specifically to counterbalance. High-speed turns whipped behind him as his massive thigh muscles fired like pistons. He didn't run. He flew low to the ground. The ground shook rhythmically. Thud. Thud. Thud, drumbeat of death. The Gasparinisaurus squealed and bolted, darting left toward a cluster of boulders. It was fast, agile, designed to dodge, but Ignis was the cheetah of his time. He saw the turn before the prey made it. He banked, his femoral muscles locking, cutting the angle sharply. The gap closed in seconds. 50 meters. 20. 10. Ignis opened his jaws. His mouth was designed like a hatchet. He could open it incredibly wide to deliver a hacking, slashing beat. He let out a roar that sounded less like a lizard's hiss and more like a guttural, bull-like bellow. Just as he lunged, a shadow swept over him. Ignis skidded, his claws tearing deep gouges into the hard earth as he barely avoided colliding with a massive wall of gray scales. He snapped his jaws shut on empty air, the Gasparinisaura vanishing into a crevice in the rocks. Ignis roared in frustration, turning to face the intruder. Standing between him and his meal was a map. It was older, slower, but significantly heavier than Ignis. It was a scavenger in these parts, bullying smaller predators off their kills. The Maposaurus hissed, saliva dripping from its serrated teeth. It didn't want to fight. It just wanted the territory. Ignis huffed, the air whistling through his nose. His horns lowered instinctively. In a prolonged brawl, the heavier theropod would crush him. But Ignis was not just a pair of jaws. He was a battering ram. The Maposaurus lunged, a slow, clumsy bite aimed at Ignis's neck. Ignis didn't retreat. He sidestepped with lightning agility, causing the larger beast to bite air. Then, Ignis utilized his unique weapon. He slammed his head sideways, driving his thick, bull-like horns into the Maposaurus's ribs. Crack! The sound of fracturing bone echoed in the canyon. The Maposaurus bellowed in pain, stumbling back, wheezing. It hadn't expected the impact to be so solid. Ignis roared again, this time flashing the red wattle beneath his throat, flushing his scales with blood to look larger, more terrifying. The Maposaurus, old and unwilling to risk a broken rib for a small snack, turned and lumbered away, growling a low warning. Ignis watched it go, his chest heaving. He had won the ground, but he had lost the food. The Gasparinosaurus was long gone. The sun beat down, unforgiving. His stomach cramped violently. He needed a kill. A real kill. He looked toward the horizon, where the jagged peaks of the Black-Tooth Mountains pierced the sky. Beyond them lay the Green Valley, a place of legend among the predators. It was said to still have water, and where there was water, there were titans. But the Green Valley belonged to him. The king, an Abelisaurid, older and crueler than any other. Ignis licked his dry chops. The fear of the king was great, but the fear of starvation was greater. He turned his horned head toward the mountains. He would go to the Green Valley. He would hunt the giants, or he would die trying. The Green Hell, the journey through the Black-Tooth Mountains, was a gauntlet of shale and razor-sharp ridges. By the time Ignis descended the southern slopes, his feet were bruised, and his energy reserves were critically low. But as the treacherous gray rock gave way to soft, loamy earth, the air changed. The dry, dusty heat of the Badlands vanished, replaced by a wall of humidity so thick it felt like breathing water. The silence of the desert was gone, too, shattered by the screeching of pterosaurs, the buzzing of prehistoric insects the size of hawks, and the distant, rhythmic thumping of giants walking the earth. Ignis had arrived. This was the Green Valley. To a starving predator, it looked like paradise. Lush ferns grew chest-high, and massive conifer trees blocked out the sun, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor. But Ignis was a creature of the open plains. His body was an arrow, evolved for straight-line speed on flat ground. Here, in the dense tangle of roots and vines, his greatest weapon, his velocity, was neutered. He moved cautiously, his three-toed feet sinking into the damp moss. He felt claustrophobic. The trees pressed in on him. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He stopped near a stream, the first clean water he had seen in weeks. He lowered his snout to drink, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. But his eyes never closed. His binocular vision scanned the undergrowth. Snap! A twig broke to his left. Ignis whipped his head around, his neck muscles tensing. Through the gaps in the giant ferns, he saw them. A small herd of Saltosaurus. They were titanosaurs. But unlike the mountain-sized giants of the north, these were compact, perhaps 30 feet long. They were a tank-like, their skin studded with bony osteoderm plates, similar to Ignis's own, designed to shatter the teeth of attackers. There were 5 of them, stripping bark from the lower trees. Ignis's stomach roared, a sound he quickly stifled with a sharp intake of breath. This was a dangerous hunt. In the open, he could isolate one and outrun it. Here, if he charged, he risked tripping on a root or slamming into a tree trunk. If he broke a leg, he was dead. He spotted a juvenile, slightly separated from the adults, struggling with a tough cycad branch. It was about half the size of the other, still heavy, but manageable. Ignis lowered his body, his tail stiffening behind him to balance his weight. He had to get close. Closer than he ever dared in the Badlands. He became a shadow, placing his feet with agonizing slowness. 50 meters. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent back toward the mountains 30 meters. The adults were grumbling, low-frequency rumbles that vibrated in Ignis's chest. 20 meters, the juvenile snapped the branch and looked up. It didn't see Ignis, but it sensed something. It let out a bleat of distress. Now or never. Ignis didn't run. He launched, He exploded from the ferns like a fired shell. The acceleration was instantaneous, throwing up a cloud of wet earth behind him. The herd panicked. The adults trumpeted, swinging their massive tails like whips. The ground shook as tons of flesh scrambled for traction. Ignis ignored the adults. His eyes were locked on the juvenile. The young sauropod tried to turn, its heavy legs churning the mud, but it was too slow. Ignis closed the distance in 2 heartbeats. He didn't bite immediately. The Saltosaurus had armor on its back. Instead, Ignis used his head. He lowered his snout, aiming his thick, bull-like horns at the soft flank just behind the creature's ribcage. Thud. The impact was sickening. Ignis hit the juvenile with the force of a speeding truck. The breath was driven out of the herbivore in a wheezing shriek, and it was knocked sideways, crashing into a tree. Ignis recoiled from the impact, shaking his head to clear the stars from his vision. The juvenile was down, kicking wildly, exposing its soft underbelly. Ignis, Loon, head. His jaws, capable of opening impossibly wide, clamped onto the exposed throat. He didn't have the bone-crushing bite force of a tyrannosaur. He didn't need it. His teeth were serrated blades. He pulled back violently, his powerful neck muscles acting as a lever. The hatchet bite did its grim work. The struggle ceased quickly. Ignis released his grip, blood painting his brown snout crimson. He stood over the kill, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The adult herd had retreated into the deeper brush, abandoning the fallen young. Had done Italiano. He had killed in the green hell. He tore into the meat, the taste of fresh, warm flesh sending a rush of euphoria through his brain. He ate voraciously, swallowing massive chunks whole. He needed to regain his strength. He needed to build his reserves. He was halfway through the meal when the feeling hit him. It was a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the primitive part of his brain, the part that remembered when his ancestors were small and hunted, screamed in alarm. He was being watched. Ignis stopped chewing. He lifted his head, blood dripping from his chin. The forest had gone silent. The insects had stopped buzzing. The birds had stopped calling. Across the clearing, in the deep gloom between 2 ancient redwood trees, a pair of eyes reflected the little light that filtered down. They were green, cold, and set in a skull that was terrifyingly familiar yet distinctly different from his own. It was an Abelisaurid, like him, but this creature was heavier, scarred, and covered in dark green scales that made it invisible in the jungle. It was an Ekrixinatosaurus, explosion-born lizard. It was the king's scout. The scout didn't attack. It just watched, memorizing Ignis's scent, sizing him up. Then, as slowly as a fog rolling in, it backed away into the darkness and vanished. Ignis let out a low hiss. The euphoria of the kill evaporated. He wasn't just a hunter here. He was a trespasser, and the king knew he was here. Ignis looked at the carcass. He took one last massive bite, ripping a haunch free to carry with him, and turned away. He couldn't stay in the open. He had to find high ground. He had to find a fortress. The war for the Green Valley had just begun. The shadow of the King Knight in the Green Valley was not dark. It was a kaleidoscope of bioluminescent fungi and the glowing eyes of nocturnal predators. But for Ignis, it was a suffocating cage. He had found a temporary shelter beneath the roots of a fallen conifer, its massive trunk creating a natural cave. He had eaten his fill of the Saltosaurus, but his metabolism, running hot from the hunt, demanded he stay alert. The wound on his flank, a parting gift from the brush he had charged through, stung in the humid air. Then the smell hit him. It wasn't the metallic temps of blood this time. It was the scent of rot, old meat, and musk. It was a territorial marker, so potent it made Ignis's eyes water. A deep, reverberating thrum shook the ground. Thum. Thum. Ignis scrambled out from the roots, his claws digging into the soft earth. He needed room to maneuver. He stepped into a clearing illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. There, waiting for him, was the king. He was an Ekrixinatosaurus, a cousin to the Carnotaurus, but built like a fortress. Where Ignis was sleek and aerodynamic, the king was a wall of muscle. He was scarred from 100 battles. His right eye was milky white, blinded years ago, and his snout was shorter, thicker, and packed with teeth designed not just to slice, but to crush bone. He was at least 2 tons heavier than Ignis. The king didn't roar. He simply opened his mouth, revealing a gullet black as pitch, and hissed a sound like steam escaping a geyser. Ignis flared his throat wattle, flashing red in the moonlight, trying to bluff. He dipped his head, displaying his horns. "I am not prey," his posture said. "I am a rival." The king didn't care. Charachet. For a creature of that size, the king was terrifyingly fast. He covered the clearing in 3 strides. Ignis tried to pivot, his leg muscles firing, but the mud betrayed him. His foot slipped on a patch of slick moss. He didn't fall, but the stumble cost him a fraction of a second. That was all the king needed. The massive head of the Ekrixinatosaurus slammed into Ignis's shoulder like a battering ram. The impact threw Ignis 5 feet into the air. He crashed into a fern bush, the breath driven from his lungs. Pain exploded in his shoulder. He scrambled up, gasping. The king was already turning for a second pass, his jaws snapping shut inches from Ignis's tail. Ignis realized with cold clarity, "I cannot win here." The trees blocked his escape routes. The mud neutralized his speed. In a boxing match, the heavyweight always beats the sprinter. Ignis turned and ran. He didn't run with dignity. He ran for his life. He crashed through vines and leaped over fallen logs, the crashing footsteps of the king close behind. Branches whipped Ignis's face, blinding him momentarily, but he didn't slow down. He needed hard ground. He needed the Badlands. The chase had lasted 4 miles. Ignis was foaming at the mouth, his heart rate nearing its limit. The king was relentless, his endurance fueled by pure rage. The intruder had entered his domain, eaten his prey, and was now trying to leave alive. That could not stand. But the terrain was changing. The towering trees of the Green Valley began to thin out. The soft, treacherous moss gave way to hard-packed dirt and gravel. The air grew drier, hotter. They were reaching the ash flats, a transitional zone between the jungle and the desert, formed by an ancient volcanic flow. It was a flat gray wasteland stretching for 3 miles. No trees, no rocks, just hard-baked earth. Ignis burst out of the tree line and onto the flats. He felt the change immediately. His claws found purchase on the gritty rock. No slipping, no sinking. The ground pushed back against his feet, returning his energy. He didn't stop, but he changed his gait. He shifted from a frantic scramble to a rhythmic, aerodynamic sprint. His tail stiffened, becoming a perfect rudder. Behind him, the king burst from the jungle, roaring a challenge that shook the remaining leaves from the trees. The king saw the open ground and surged forward, thinking the kill was imminent. He was powerful, yes, but he was built for the ambush, for the brawl. He was not built for the marathon. Ignis checked his speed. He was currently running at 40 kilometers per hour fast, but not his top speed. He could hear the king gaining. Good. Come closer, Ignis thought, his predator brain plotting the geometry of death. He let the king get within 10 meters. He could hear the heavy wheezing of the larger dinosaur. The king lowered his head, preparing to bite Ignis's tail to hamstring him. Now, Ignis engaged his full power. He didn't just accelerate, he engaged a turn that defied physics for an animal his size. He planted his right foot, threw his heavy tail to the left as a counterweight, and executed a 90-degree turn at full sprint. The king couldn't do that. The massive Ekrixinatosaurus tried to follow the turn, but his momentum was too great. His heavy legs crossed, and he skidded violently, carving deep trenches into the ash. He nearly toppled over, roaring in frustration as he had to come to a near stop to turn around. Ignis didn't flee. Circlet. He was now flanking the king. Ignis was dancing. He sprinted in a wide arc, moving at 50 kilometers per hour, a blur of crimson scales. The king turned to face him, snapping his jaws, but he was too slow. Ignis was a fighter jet, circling a battleship. Ignis ran past the king's rear flank, snapping his jaws in a mock bite, just to confuse the giant. The king spun around, wasting precious energy. Ignis repeated the maneuver. Run. Turn. Feint. Run. Turn. Feint. He was draining the king's battery. The massive Abelisaurid was panting heavily now, his tongue lolling out, saliva flying. His movements were becoming sluggish. The heavy armor that protected him was now a burden weighing him down in the heat of the flats. Ignis stopped 50 meters away. He turned to face the king. He wasn't running anymore. The crimson crown, the sun, was rising over the ash flats, casting long, dramatic shadows across the gray earth. The king stood in the center of the wasteland, chest heaving, his one good eye fixed on the smaller, faster demon that tormented him. Ignis pawed the ground. This was the moment his evolution had designed him for. The Carnotaurus is the only carnivorous dinosaur known to have fused nasal bones in a reinforced neck, specifically adapted to absorb the shock of a high-speed impact. He was not a wrestler. He was a living missile. Ignis lowered his head until his snout was parallel to the ground. His horns, thick and conical, pointed directly at the king's chest. He wrote a short, sharp bark of aggression. The king, exhausted but proud, accepted the challenge. He roared back and lumbered forward, gathering speed for a final bone-crushing collision. He would catch the smaller beast and crush its skull. Ignis charged. 0 to 50 kilometers per hour in seconds. The wind screamed in Ignis's ear holes. The world blurred at the edges of his vision. All that existed was the center of the king's chest. The king opened his jaws to bite, expecting Ignis to come within range of his teeth. But Ignis didn't bite. At the last second, he ducked his head lower, slipping under the king's snapping jaws. Impact. Ignis slammed into the king's chest with the force of a falling elevator. The twin horns drove into the thick muscle and scales, not piercing deep enough to kill instantly, but delivering a massive kinetic shock wave. The physics were undeniable. The king was heavy, but he was off balance and tired. The force of Ignis's speed lifted the 2-ton giant off his front feet. The king was knocked backward. He flailed, his tail slapping the ground, but he couldn't recover. He crashed onto his side with the ground shaking THUD, the air whooshing out of him in a pained grunt. Ignis didn't wait. He didn't gloat. The moment the king hit the dirt, Ignis was on him. He leaped onto the exposed neck of the fallen giant. The king thrashed, his massive legs kicking comfortably at the air, but he couldn't right himself in time. Ignis opened his hatchet jaws to their full angle of almost 90 degrees and drove his upper teeth down in a violent hacking motion. He targeted the soft skin beneath the throat. Once, twice. The king shuddered. A gargled roar escaped his throat, turning into a wet cough. The massive legs stopped kicking. The single good eye stared up at the rising sun, then glazed over. Ignis stepped back, his chest heaving, his scales slick with blood. He looked around the ash flats. Silence. He raised his head to the sky and let out a sound that had not been heard in this valley for a generation. It was the high-pitched, resonant bellow of the meat-eating bull. It echoed off the distant trees of the green valley and bounced back from the rocks of the Badlands. The scavengers watching from the tree line froze. The raptors in the tall grass went silent. The old king was dead. The heavy, slow tyranny of the Ekrixinatosaurus was over. A new era had begun. An era of speed, precision, and blood. Ignis turned and walked back toward the green valley. He walked with a limp, his shoulder bruised and aching, but he did not hide. He didn't need to skulk in the shadows anymore. He was the Crimson Bull, and the valley was his pasture.